Low carb diet versus a Mediterranean diet for insulin resistance, diabetes, metabolic dysfunction. What's going to take the cake? Well, with this, we need to look at multiple bodies of research. We need to understand the entire dynamics that go into things. With the Mediterranean diet, it's easy for us to think that it's all additive, right? Okay, the Mediterranean diet is great because it has vegetables and because it has fruit and because it has this and that and these different minerals and these different vitamins. But we also forget the fact that a Mediterranean diet is subtractive, right? We have less of these refined starches, less of the sugars, less of the cruddy kinds of fats, less of the saturated fats, right? So on one hand, yes, we get all these additional benefits, but we also get huge subtractive benefits. We have to ask ourselves the same question with a lower carb diet. Are the benefits of a lower carb diet additive because of the presence of ketones or because of the presence of other stressors that happen with a low carb diet? Or is it subtractive? Is it because we're not eating the sugar, we're not eating the starches, we're not eating the carbs? Well, it's a little bit of both, but we have to be careful because we can run into a situation where we improperly demonize certain carbs because we have so much success on a low carb diet. As someone that largely follows a low carb protocol, and I have for the last 12 or 13 years, I can tell you that it's very, very easy to start thinking all carbs are problematic. When in reality, I would argue the primary benefit from a ketogenic diet is the presence of ketones. So it truly is additive. Now, that's just me talking. Let's look at some research that compares low carb to Mediterranean. So this study was published in Nutrients, and it compared a low carb diet to a Mediterranean diet. They found for weight loss that the low carb diet was more effective than a Mediterranean diet. That makes a lot of sense because you have less insulin standing in the way of lipolysis. Okay, insulin is going to impair lipolytic function. It's going to stop the hormone-sensitive lipase. It's going to stop fatty acids from being liberated until that insulin clears, which is usually pretty quick. But if you're constantly eating carbohydrates, it could be impairing that quite a bit. But what's interesting is when it looked at metabolic markers and just glucose markers and stuff like that with this study, the Mediterranean diet and the low carb diet had about the same outcomes. They both had similar effects on hyperinsulinemia, so reducing insulin levels. They both had similar effects on fasting glucose, fasting insulin, and they both had very similar effects on beta cell sensitivity, which is interesting because a low carb diet is probably improving beta cell sensitivity just by abstaining from carbohydrates, whereas a Mediterranean diet, which can be arguably moderately high in carbohydrates, was probably affecting beta cells in the pancreas by the addition of monounsaturated fats. So what I mean by that is, if you look at how the pancreas secretes insulin, it receives a signal from the liver after the liver has detected glucose in the bloodstream, okay? And it sends that signal to the pancreas, and the pancreatic beta cells release insulin. Okay, if the pancreatic beta cells are constantly being bombarded with a signal from carbohydrates and starches, eventually they're going to get burnt out. So abstaining from carbohydrates in a low carb fashion will allow this to sort of get more sensitivity because it gets a chance to have a break. Now, on the side of a Mediterranean diet, monounsaturated fats like macadamia nuts, like avocados, like olive oil, these monounsaturated fats can restore and help pancreatic beta cell function independently. So that's what's interesting. So beta cell sensitivity improved via potentially two different mechanisms within the two different groups. So is one better than the other? It looks as though for metabolic health, they both improved things similarly. Now, I want to look at some more data so we can come to a little bit more of a conclusion, but I also want to be able to give you things that you can do tactfully in your diet to sort of adopt the Mediterranean principle, but also adopt a lower carb method as well, okay? So when you're looking at this kind of thing, monounsaturated fats, whether you are low carb or Mediterranean, are hugely beneficial. Contrary to popular belief, olive oil, if it's a good stable olive oil, is fine to cook with as long as it's not going crazy high heat. If you're like cooking a steak or you're cooking something on a pan, you'd be fine to use olive oil as long as you're not getting it up to its crazy high smoke point where you're searing things and trying to char things. That you don't want to do. Straight up olives, macadamia nuts, avocados, even though they're not regionally like Mediterranean, they still work very, very well. So those are kinds of monounsaturated fats that should be staples in a low carb diet and should be staples in a Mediterranean diet. I also put a link down below for Thrive Market, which is an online grocery store that you can sort by diet type. And I think it's really cool because you can sort by low carb or sort by keto, and it basically like opens up a grocery store just for keto or vegan or whatever you want to do. You just check that filter, makes it really cool. And that's a 30% off discount link. So the link down below in the description, 30% off your entire grocery order when you use that link. Plus you get a $50 free gift as well when you use that link because you're going through my channel. So that link, because they are a sponsor, you get 30% off your entire first order. So definitely check them out. They don't have a Mediterranean section specifically, but we're working on it. I'm working with their executive team on creating that because there's a lot of demand for it. People ask all the time. So again, that link down below this video, first line of the description. So now we look at another study that was published in the journal Diabetes Care. Took a look at people that were healthy, but were still at risk of developing type 2 diabetes, which really is anybody, right? So there are 418 people, and they looked this over the course of 4 years. Okay, what they found is that Mediterranean diet compared to control diet, there was a 52% less incidence of developing type 2 diabetes. Now, that doesn't come as a huge surprise, simply because they're comparing this to probably a Western sort of like control diet, right? So standard American diet. Any improvement over a standard American diet is going to yield a powerful result. But they found basically the closer that people adhered to these Mediterranean principles, the better effect they had. So compared to a standard American diet, it doesn't matter whether you go low carb or whether you go Mediterranean. But I suppose the question that comes to mind is this: could you follow a standard American diet in principle but in a low carb fashion? Well, that doesn't really exist because a standard American diet is high processed food, high grains, high starches, high refined starches. But could you eat garbage food, but just low carb, and have a better effect than you would with a Mediterranean diet? And from a weight loss perspective, you might initially. So what I suggest here is if that's the only way that you can make a change, is to still eat the kind of junk food that you eat, but just eliminating the carbohydrates. If that is a way for you to get the weight off initially, I understand and I respect that, and I'm not going to stand in your way. But what I do suggest is when it comes down to maintenance, once you lose the weight, you do not want to continue eating that style. Migrate over to a more Mediterranean keto for maintenance. Mediterranean type keto where you're still eating low carb, but you're implementing Mediterranean principles, like again, the olive oil, the lean meats, and things like that. Now, would you get the best benefit if you started with a Mediterranean keto option? You probably would, okay? Would you get a better benefit of going Mediterranean full-blown than you would standard American style keto? From your blood markers and things like that, you probably would, because a lot of the benefits from a Mediterranean diet come from the fact that you are getting a reduction in reactive oxygen species, oxidative stress, you're getting reductions in inflammation, and these are all hugely beneficial to metabolic function. So you might get the weight off, which is going to have a huge impact on you metabolically, arguably the biggest impact. Okay, but when it comes down to inflammation and these things that affect you long term, you might not be getting that big of an impact. So it really is kind of 6 in one, half a dozen in the other. Okay, low carb keto works tremendous for weight loss and it's tremendous for the brain, but we also have another component that we haven't talked about, and that's the presence of ketone bodies. So when you're low carb, it's great for weight loss, sure, but you're not getting the same effect with a Mediterranean diet as you are with keto, because in a Mediterranean diet, you're not getting the presence of ketones. Okay, ketones are what the body produces when you are deficient in carbohydrates. So it produces an alternative fuel called ketones. Now these ketones aren't just fuel. These ketones affect the brain. These ketones affect our genes through what's called histone deacetylase inhibition. So they have huge programming effects and signaling device effects on our body. Also huge anti-inflammatory effects. And this is only going to happen if you're on a very low carb diet enough to produce ketones. So we're back to square one. Okay, well now we have this additional benefit. So where's the competition landing? Like, where is this going? Here's what I would suggest. If you just want to lose weight and you're not worried about anything else, try keto. Go keto, okay? if you want to do it for a long time, you need to do keto with better principles. You can't just go what's called dirty keto all the time. You need to be able to apply Mediterranean healthy principles to your keto diet eventually, or you're going to end up down a very nasty road. Okay? If you do Mediterranean, do it for lifestyle and modulate the amount of carbs you consume with your activity. More activity, you can have more carbs. But one thing that I think is very important is if you do Mediterranean, you should implement some form of time-restricted feeding. The benefit that we get with keto that we don't get with Mediterranean is the suppression of insulin. This is hugely beneficial, contrary to what some people on the other side of the dietary dogma community will say. Okay, suppression of insulin is decently good for helping you lose weight. So you can get the best of both worlds if you apply intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding. So you take your Mediterranean style approach, and 3 or 4 days per week, you eat in a 6-hour or 8-hour window. Plain and simple. Consolidate your meals, giving yourself an opportunity to A, suppress insulin levels, and B, possibly even create ketones just by the sheer absence of food. You potentially get the best of both worlds. So one is not better than the other. Keto might be a little better for weight loss, but Mediterranean's better long term. So combine them, do a little fasting, and you're off to the races. I'll see you tomorrow.